Cancer? I think that's the only one I can recognize on your bookshelf.
Hey, we see like the.
Oh, sorry. It's because I was bent over inspecting Tammy's.
I know. I'm sorry. It's a
bookshelf.
mess.
I think that is Tropic of Cancer. It's the only one I can tell.
It might be. It's a mess.
We're gonna get started in another minute. Thanks for joining us tonight, people on the webinar.
So can people still sign up if, or is it too late?
I think we can just join.
Yeah, halfway through, it's fine.
All right, hold on.
Are people asking if they can sign up?
I was just gonna say I was gonna put it on our Twitter.
So if you are just joining us, which you probably are because this just started, you can also watch this on YouTube where it will be simulcast and it has closed captioning. So if you would like closed captioning, you can head over to YouTube and the link's going to be in the chat. And otherwise, we're just going to get started in another minute. Thanks for joining us. We are extremely excited to be here with Time to Say Goodbye podcast, folks.
Hi.
Okay. All right. I think we can get started. I feel like it's 7:04.
Yeah, I think we should get started.
Cool. Okay. So as I said, this is the Jewish Currents Time to Say Goodbye event. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ariel Angel. I'm the editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents. And I guess, should I introduce people? No, everyone should just introduce themselves, I think.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Josh, do you want to start us off, actually?
Sure, I can introduce myself. I'm Josh Leifer. I'm an assistant editor at Jewish Currents.
I'm Jay, part of the Time to Say Goodbye podcast, and I'm a writer at large at the New York Times Magazine.
I'm Andy. I'm part-time to Say Goodbye, and I'm a historian of modern China.
I am Tammy. I'm the third member of Time to Say Goodbye, and I work as a freelance writer.
Cool. Josh, you were the one who, you're the impetus for this whole event.
Yeah, I can give a little. I'll give a little bit of background. So, I mean, what this is now the result of what was at first initially a somewhat enthusiastic fan response of wanting to do something with Time to Say Goodbye last August when I first reached out to Jay, and I'm super excited that we're having this conversation. I'll just say a little bit about what struck me listening and why I felt it was important to do this. At Jewish Currents, we deal a lot with Jewish politics and Jewish history and what it means to be Jewish in the world. But the structure of a lot of those questions are in some way unique to Jews, but in some ways not. And when I was listening to the Time to Say Goodbye podcast, I was just struck, and Ariel and I were talking about this kind of with a sense of relief that there were other people who were thinking about how to engage politically in the world in similar ways, with similar questions, similar dilemmas, obviously important, significant differences. And it struck me that we can't think our way out of the current moment in isolation, and it requires, especially from a left perspective, it requires speaking with other people who are different and also encountering that difference and encountering the similarity. And so that kind of became part of the impetus. I think it's also interesting that, we'll get into this as we continue the conversation. The right has actually begun to, in some ways, knows this perhaps even better than the left in some ways. And there is a kind of emerging, quite politically assertive kind of reactionary coalition that involves Jews and Asian Americans in large part. And since both the podcast and then the magazine in some ways are addressing and counterposed to that coalition, I thought it made sense to have a kind of conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we also feel you know, we talked about this a little before, but we also, I think that we feel the same isolation at times, and it's strange because you know, there's so much conversation around the left, but also, you know, around all things, and yeah, it sometimes feel like we're so siloed into this one thing, and times it can be almost like a little claustrophobic because we're like, well, we, you know, we have to somehow satisfy these two things that we're doing, and do we even really believe in, you know, the identity part, right? Like, do we really believe in like the could be a conversation? Um, and sometimes, you know, sometimes there have been times where it's like, well, we should, you know, there are times where like maybe we shouldn't talk about Asian stuff for a while because, and then you feel like bad because you're like, what is this internalized racism shit, you know? But then, but then you're just like, well, you know, like obviously our politics are not sort of a strict identity politics in that sort of way, and so sometimes we want to move away from it. And honestly, a lot of the times we're not particularly interested in those types of questions. So, yeah, like we didn't have an Oscars, you know, episode or anything, or anything like that. Where like,
Last
you
year,
know,
this year, yeah, for all the
yeah, it
Asian
wasn't
voters.
like, all right, you know, the grandma. I was happy she won, but you know, there's not much else you can say, right? You just be like, all right, let's go. So yeah, this is I don't know, even the short conversations we've had leading up to this have been very helpful in that, and you know, I think it's important to make those types of connections.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, I'm curious if like anyone has any other thoughts about maybe like why do this before we even like transition into thinking through our particular positions and all of this. But it did strike me that, I mean, part of the reason why it's important for us to talk about this, both just as people who are seen in some way as representative of a certain kind of communal politics or developing leftist politics within these communities, and also people who are making media and making like what could be described as like ethnic media very crudely. I think it's, yeah, I mean,
Oh no.
that's what they, I mean, you know, for us, it's like not that weird to call Jewish media ethnic media, you know, but like, I mean, I don't enjoy calling it that, but like, that's what it is called. Or, you know, in some kind of way. So, like, what does it mean to make that, and especially what does it mean to make that from a position? You know, from listening to your show, I'm really struck by the way that you are sort of like pushing against the boundaries of that identity category while also like inhabiting it and speaking from that position. And so I thought maybe that was a place for us to start in conversation.
I'm curious also when Josh just mentioned that you mentioned this phrase in this current moment, you know, we need these conversations. So what do you mean in particular when you say this current moment? Like why now versus like 20 years ago or 80, I don't know, 30 years ago or something?
I mean, I can't speak to 30 years ago because I was not alive.
Oh no, Josh.
But
not last year, no.
But I will say that, I mean, I think more specifically the particular issues that that seemed thematically relevant. I mean, and you've all addressed this in various podcasts. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the one with Naomi Murakawa, which I thought was fantastic. And, you know, she mentioned specifically the role of the Anti-Defamation League. And I mean, for those who don't know, this podcast was about the hate crimes and really like concretized the way that a kind of liberal establishment politics around hate crimes is pushing forth carceral solutions. And so, you know, in January of, I guess it was 2020, I think it
Yeah,
must have been, there was this spate of attacks on Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn that were not carried out by white people. So it wasn't a pattern of attack that could be put into the kind of white nationalist terror narrative. And it began to surface within the Jewish community, at least, a very frightening current of reactionary carceral politics. I mean, you had people here who were calling for Bill de Blasio to send in the National Guard to Crown Heights. And that very much frightened me. And, you know,
and they also pushed back bail reform on that. I mean,
that's right.
And so, you know, with the attacks against Asian Americans over the past I mean, I guess year and a half, we've also seen certain kinds of kind of carceral solutions to this. And so I think that like that particularly, if we're thinking about like where the right is making common cause on an issue and the left feels like we're kind of falling, like, I don't know, we're caught off balance a little bit by how to respond. Like that seemed one particular area where like intercommunal conversation on this among like left-leaning people across communities was like absolutely necessary, because it's happening in other political spaces.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a whole conversation that's not part of the, like sort of national conversation within the media that you understand is going on, that is upsetting and somewhat scary. And, I mean, that's how I felt about these attacks, where I was just like, well, I know what I know what people I know are saying on Kakao Talk about this stuff, and it's not about white supremacy. And, I can say, and, these are people who vote for Joe Biden, right? It's not like they're the right, right? They're mostly liberals. And, what they want is more police. And yeah, that is a definite feeling of isolation, because like there's part of you that understands why those people generally who don't have a lot of means and are not by any means wealthy or even insulated from this type of violence, why they would feel that way. Because of course that's just in America, that's your reaction. You're like, I need protection, and your first thought is, I need more police. Why are the police abandoning us? Yeah, and it's hard to find that space where you can make your argument without without immediately being called sort of a traitor, or traitor is the worst, but nice people at least say, well, you don't care, like what, like you're so privileged, like like you don't care, like go walk around Oakland Chinatown for a bit and tell me how you feel. So yeah, it's even if you do live in those areas and you have walked around those areas, like it's sort of this authenticity thing, right? Like you're not a real person who cares about your people if you are having this type of reaction. And then there's certainly a lot of alienation that comes out of it. So that seems similar. And yeah, I was living in Crown Heights when those attacks were happening, and I remember I remember just feeling like, well, it is a little like, I understand where people feel like this is being kind of like held at arm's length, right? And I think that is a lot of the frustration within a lot of the Asian community right now, which is just like, and then when you feel that way, then of course you have stronger reactionary politics, because you feel like people are lying to you, right? Like they're saying, oh, you don't actually care, you just are trying to protect this group or whatever. And that leads to even more reactionary politics.
I think another element of the why is this relevant now is that we're both part of communities in which this sort of domestic violence, meaning in the US violence, and the sort of alignments of our ethnic communities here is always refracted against and through our relations with, in your case, Israel, and in our case, China as sort of just a symbol of Asia generally, right? The sort of other hegemon, or in the case of Israel, this kind of somehow Teflon partner, And so I think I was really happy to connect with you guys and to kind of process that. And, that's obviously why we've titled our event this way tonight, also around diasporic internationalism. Like, what does that mean? In a time where it also feels like maybe a little bit of an inflection point around kind of the international order. Like, what is our specific role as progressive Asians, as progressive Jews, to push back against a kind of establishment vision of foreign policy that has historically been very cruel to our communities?
Yeah, I think that.
Oh, go ahead, Andy.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, I think that's right. I agree with what Tammy was saying in terms of when Josh was talking about this current moment. I was like, well, what about this current moment? I guess I would think, obviously COVID, and then we're all living in this kind of post 2008 world where it does seem like a window of leftist politics has been opened in the US, but I'm actually like lately wondering if it's closing, and that might be the moment that Josh is referring to. And that is, of course, these are global crises, which would require us individuals to think, perhaps starting from your most familiar friends and family, but to also think about problems and solutions in a global framework. And so, I mean, I think it's already a huge leap for an Asian American to think about this in Asian diasporic terms, like, Asia and the US, but it's obviously even more of a leap to think about it, across groups and across, and Europe too, or other continents also. And the other thing I was thinking was in terms of the comment that Jay was talking about, I think that it was striking how the safest, most mainstream way to talk about anti-Asian violence was through hate crime language, and the people who sponsored the bill that eventually got passed were Democrats, right? So they were supposed to be the mainstream Asian American Democratic politicians. I do think there was a current, right, of pushback, and like people we talked to, obviously, and other parts of social media. I don't know how much influence all that stuff has. It wasn't crazy to talk about, to question hate crime legislation.
Yeah.
But it obviously wasn't mainstream. And I think this raises a question in terms of what is the safest way to talk about victimization, and how is there a space to talk about it in a way that's different than that safe space, right? I know you all have been talking about this in your own magazine in terms of, is there a way to challenge conventional wisdom about anti-Semitism? And I think that might be an interesting conversation to talk about also.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is going to take us in a different direction, and also like I'm hesitant to even say what I'm about to say just because I'm like not really a historian of this time period. But your question about like why now as opposed to like 30 years ago, I probably would jump back to like the 70s, more than 30 years ago, and think about, I mean, when I think about the story that I've hearing recently in terms of what happened to like Jewish radicals in that moment, and also what was happening with Asian American radicals in that moment, like thinking about how both groups were sort of realizing that they couldn't organize with Black radicals, and trying to figure out like where do we go from here, and also like taking their cues from Black organizers in that moment. When I think of what happened to Jews and like the way that Jews rooted in Jewish identity politics, and sort of the stuff that I would consider not great that came out of that, like particularly with like the Soviet Jewish movement and like the Cold War politics of that. I don't think about like, I don't hear about, and maybe it was happening and I don't know about it, but it seems like at that point there was a real divergence. Like, Asian American organizing also gets like grouped with like ethnic studies and like third worldism and all of that stuff, which is, of course, that makes sense. But I think there was maybe a missed moment or a missed opportunity in some ways for like people to find common ground in other areas. And I was talking about this a little bit with Josh earlier, but like it does seem that some of the way through some of these like very knotty conversations that we've been having is sort of recognizing that we that like if we are building coalition, that there are ways that like we are aligned on some things and not on others, and that there's a lot of these different kinds of flows within a larger group, that there are things that like Asian American experience has in common with like Latinx experience, and then there are things that it has in common with Jewish American experience, and that if we are like looking at all of the different alignments, that actually like provides some balance in some kind of way. And I feel like maybe there was like a missed opportunity for that in this like very intensive moment of identity creation that seems like maybe we have like another shot at it. And at the same time, all of these like very like difficult and toxic elements are like coming to the surface in terms of, that are making it really, really hard to do that, So right. I don't know.
Yeah, it's I think that I was always struck with like, I was thinking about this and this is generally how I feel about, like the Asian American politics in general, that the right has like a better, cleaner argument to make, right? It's and especially in terms of places of solidarity in politics, you can see the like Asian and Jewish right-wing politics obviously fitting together around issues of education and things like that. And so I don't know, I think that you're right. It does sort of make it even more important for people who are not on the right to make sure that the political conversation around this are not all just fighting back against what the right is saying, right? Like, because I think that's sort of where we are right now. You know, that was the whole push against the hate crime stuff that, you know, like that we try and do in our tiny way on the podcast or writing or whatever. But you know, that's a reaction, you know, it's a position where you're on the defensive, right? You're basically telling people don't do that. And I don't know, it's difficult to have that just be the only thing that you do over and over and over again. So I do think it's important to like define these types of things and to find these sort of, you know, moments where you can have some sort of solidarity or coalition building and to not fret too much about it. You know, I think the problem is that like there's so much, you just worry about everything that you're going to say and how other people are going to be like, well, it's not really the same, you know? And then of course you're like also worried that you're relying on these horrible stereotypes, you know, of which like I'm sure we could list off 8 of them where it's like, oh yeah, they're the same because of X, Y, and Z, you know? But you know, I don't know. I think it's better to just kind of, you know, sort that out later, maybe, because we're just in a very dire moment right now. I agree that we're.
But that's also why I find the show such a relief, you know, is because like I don't have to be a part of that conversation to listen to you guys having the conversation, and in a probably like very gauche way, I'm just like substituting Jews for everything.
We invite that.
But it's like great, you know, like it's like really nice to hear people think in public, and then you have like this basis actually for like having a shared conversation once you understand the contours of the way that
I mean, you know, just reading the article you all wrote about anti-Semitism, what struck me was this fact that you all were confronting head on not just the stereotype, anti-Semitic stereotype of money, but that, you know, there might be an economic reality that might correspond to it, or that's at least worth a debate. And I think that's what, I mean, like the basic reason why comparisons happen between Asian groups and Jewish groups is because of money and wealth and upward class mobility. And I think that is something that we talk about on our show a lot, like being fully aware that we're not exhaustive of the Asian diaspora, that it's actually quite polarized and that they're very, you know, it is literally polarized. The generation post 65, right, is, you know, on the one hand, the richest minority group, on the other hand, you know, a very poor minority group as well. And the income gap is larger and larger. And that is kind of something we talk about all the time. And that is the context, right, within which we can have our conversations. And I think what I'm still trying to figure out, but I think is like a really important step for Asian American, Asian diasporic leftists is to confront rather than run away from stereotypes, and one to think about what is the material basis behind these. It isn't to say that, you know, it isn't just to say like, oh, we're evil and we control the global, you know, financial system or whatever, but to say like, well, what is the position one has? Obviously, like the classic leftist position is we are all workers, we are the underdogs, and we want to overthrow power, etc. Well, you know, we don't really, not at least I don't have access to that, right? I don't know how we all feel, and I think that is a question worth asking of. Well, what do you do? Is it just class guilt?
Andy's a class traitor.
I mean, you know, it's like, let's just be honest, you know, like workers are the, you know, that doesn't include all of us, right? I mean, you know, we can talk about like, yeah, I actually am like a wage worker in a university and so on, right? But there's differences. So yeah, like the reason why anti-Semitic and anti-Asian like stereotypes overlap, but are also like the reason why like there is this sort of, you know, weird like Amy Chua-esque valorization of Jewish and Asian people is the same as the flip side of each other, right? That they are upwardly mobile minority groups within the US. And yeah, and I feel like, you know, what you all seem to be getting at in the article is like, we shouldn't run away from this, because when you just make it about bad stereotypes, then you just kind of allow like the right to like take over and do whatever they want. Is that a fair reading of the article?
I think it's like, I mean, I think Josh should answer actually.
I think it is a fair, I'll say like, I think it's a fair reading of the article, because I think that was part of what we were trying to do is have an honest conversation about how an over-reliance on victimhood as an entryway to politics would obscure the actual power that just like the community wields and in real life. And like, you know, I think the criticisms that we got were mainly about that like perhaps you actually need the entry point of victimhood in a strategic sense, because even if people don't experience like the world as victims in their everyday, it's funny, we were just talking in this Jewish Current Slack about this concept of post memory, and so actually this is why I feel like it's relevant, that like there is a carryover like experience that might be mediated through a generational transfer of oppression and marginalization, and there is also like real experience in real life, and it's a kind of constant. A friend of mine I'm going to paraphrase him, but put it, you have to constantly rejuggle it and assess it in each particular circumstance where you're encountering this. It's really hard. Like, I think the other thing is like, to be a critical, progressive, whatever you want to call it, on the left, and using your identity as a entry point to politics, you have to be critical about it. I mean, in that way. It's funny, Andy, when you were talking, I was immediately thinking like, oh, since this now we're going to get into the Iko Day book about, I mean, it's just, I mean, I think it is, that I think what's particularly, what I wasn't sure about actually when we were writing the responsa, was the extent, which we call that editorial, was actually to the extent, like, I was like, is it possible that Jews are not legible as Jews in America anymore? Mm-hmm. And that there was something different about America, and its history of Jewish racialization or lack thereof, mm-hmm. that meant that, so in Europe, compared to Europe, where in Europe, like, I mean, one example of this is like George, and I think I want to, like, I can be more ambivalent maybe in this forum than I could be on a page. Like, it's very clear to me that in Hungary, George Soros means something very particular. People know what that means when the George Soros name is invoked. In the United States, it's not at all clear to me that George Soros means Jew when he's invoked on Glenn Beck or whatever. And in fact, like a lot of well, this is now. Do you think I'm
recently
wrong?
That might have changed.
I've seen a Reddit meme once. I don't know.
I mean, in fact, like a lot of the response that we got, or like some of the criticism that we got, was about sort of like the shape of anti-Semitism without Jews, like the fact that anti-Semitism is a force that actually like isn't necessarily moored to Jews. And I almost feel like, I mean, I don't think that that's what the argument of what you sent from Alien Capital from that book is saying. There is sort of a way that there's a description of like the shape of something,
I think a lot of, I mean, I actually just talked to her today, just like a total coincidence of scheduling.
Maybe you could say exactly what
do you want to just introduce it for the
It's a book called Alien Capital by Iko Day at Mount Holyoke College. Writing about Asian racialization, but beginning with this metaphor, or this question of the comparison between the two groups. And the basic premise is something like, if we think of racism typically as a view of a group as inferior, that doesn't really apply to Asians and not to Jewish people either, right? The racial metaphor is more that they are threatening, right? And that they are perhaps almost superior, right? Like there's this sort of conspiracy theory behind the scenes, undermining the average, in this case, probably a white waspy kind of worker. I don't know if workers are waspy, white Christian, right? And I think one thing she brought up was that I think this is true, that a lot of xenophobia right now takes on a lot of the same form as anti-Semitism in the past. Now, I don't know what that means. I'm not trying to throw this out here as like a victimization narrative, because again, like maybe there is a reason to be, there is a reason to criticize, the Chinese state, if not Chinese people, right? Like there is a reason to like, you don't want to like just get into this like, well, all metaphors are bad, stereotypes are bad, without thinking about, well, what is the actual underlying concrete reality or history of what is going on? But I do think I don't think it's a controversial statement that the way that China, right, as this dark, entity floating around, is probably similar to the way that anti-Semitism, it's kind of it's formally similar to like anti-Semitism back in the day, like in Europe, I guess, right?
I mean, I think just to like, thinking about the particular moment also with regards to the global situation. I mean, I think the the role that China is playing vis-a-vis Asian Americans and the role that the Soviet Union played vis-a-vis Jewish Americans in the post-war era. I mean, if you think about the McCarthy era as kind of what some, people say was sort of the last spasm of institutional anti-Semitism in the United States in a real way. And with, like, you think about the Rosenbergs and the way that they became a symbol of like ambivalent Jewish assimilation, but also pegged to the great power competition and ideological competition with the United States. I mean, I think it's been to me, and I think Peter Beinart, who is an editor-at-large for Jewish Currents, wrote a piece about this, that there were a lot of ways in which the new Cold War was also at risk of prompting a kind of new Red Scare within academia and putting Asian American scholars in particular, I think, was that article in a very difficult position. I'm curious if, like, how you think about, like, what would it mean if politically to actually push back on this? Because, I mean, just in the Jewish case in the 50s, I mean, what to do about the Rosenbergs, like fractured parts of the left, and so it was.
What do you mean? I don't actually know that history.
Just whether whether the Rosenbergs were a threat to Jewish thriving in America because they were disloyal to the American liberal project, or whether it was actually an anti-Semitic thing that they were targeted, and in order to, like, defend both, like, Jewish particularity, but also, like, Jewish left particularity, like defending the Rosenbergs in that case was necessary.
And defending the USSR by extension.
Well, it's like, could you do one without the other? And I think, like, I mean, full disclosure, the Jewish Currents has a particular institutional history around this.
We were a Communist Party USA organ.
Yeah, sure. So are we. No.
I think maybe that exists to some extent with regards to China right now in a discourse that we talk about on the show sometimes around, like, kind of tankies, like Asian tankyism. And, to what extent your views of China, what they mean in terms of, like, how good of an Asian or Asian American you are. And so, if we have a special episode like the one that Andy organized with a scholar of the Uyghur situation in China, Darren Byler, then, we'll be accused of being basically like CIA plants, or, like loving the US because we're criticizing China. But if, it's also obviously we're opening ourselves up to criticism if we, say something, very approving of China and critically, et cetera. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of this kind of double bind in that scenario because of the particular power politics arrangement of the US and China right now. So that's something we're trying to, I don't know, I was going to say trying to navigate, but we don't really feel bound by that. Like, we just do what we want. But I think that discourse is set up there to kind of trap people.
Yeah.
It's also very new. I mean, I didn't even know that it existed until Andy told me about it. It was like, have you seen our Twitter mentions? It's a very, I don't know. I see it as like this next formation of identity, of Asian American identity, because most of the people who are doing this are Asian American, and most of them, I would say, were born here.
Not all of them. I think there's two strands, but there's definitely an Asian American specific strand for sure.
Yeah. So the people who are born here, it's like they have found that identity politics, as many of us, including the three of us, have found, are pretty, like they suck. It's like not great to have like Asian American sort of liberal, progressive, even identity politics is not great. You get tired of talking about crazy rich Asians. You get tired of getting mad at Scarlett Johansson. Like, there must be something else here, right? And then you go internationally and then you find that there's a new form of identity that is sort of about rabidly defending whatever home country that you're from. But it's interesting because it's not necessarily like, I would say that it's the thing that I found the most interesting is that, like, people who are Korean, like me and Tammy, who sort of are in this camp, they're not tankies about Korea, because, like, it's not like there's too much criticism of South Korea. They're not tankies about North Korea, because I think it's almost like too far.
There might be a few, but yeah.
Yeah,
There's some, I'd say
hard to
some.
defend North Korea. I'm my family is from North Korea, and I have never felt the compulsion to like be like, actually, you misunderstood everything about North Korea, and everything that the West has told you is a lie. But it's all sort of gravitating towards China, and then it really does center around this question of Xinjiang and what is happening with the Uyghur population there. And I don't know, I guess I find it really interesting because like what sort of drew everyone to that point and why, and to me it feels like it is really the same reason why people are drawn to identity questions in the first place, usually like in college or wherever. I think that this is just sort of the accelerated version of that, and maybe it is showing like the wear of sort of the more well-worn identity stuff that Asian people tend to get into in college, which is like, let's read, this is not to knock these books, but it's like, let's read Woman Warrior, let's read, let's read Frank Chin, let's learn about Vincent Chin, and let's talk about, let's do like potlucks and stuff like that. And there's something about that seems to be breaking, which I find to be totally fascinating. Like, I think that it'll look especially after these attacks, whatever the identity will be totally different. I think it'll be much more international, which, you generally were like, great, but I don't know. It's right now we don't see sort of the other version of it, right? We just sort of see this, I don't know. I don't even really like using the word tanky, but I guess it's the word to use, like this sort of like hyper-nationalistic version of it.
I feel like I have a lot of questions that I don't know which go here, but I'll try something, and if nobody thinks it's interesting, we don't have to talk about it. But I mean, I guess one of the reasons, or like one of the things that keeps coming up in talking about this conversation, like on, with Josh, and is like sort of like the moment of identity formation that like Asian Americans are in, versus like the moment that Jewish Americans are in, like in their life as like Americans as such. And I don't know. I mean, I think, like, I've heard you all talk about, and you were just talking a bit about it right now, Jay, about like this particular moment of identity formation and sort of like being worried about like the thinness of that in some way. I mean, like you guys talk about, we talk about like our analog would be like talking about bagels, like how that's the whole identity.
We do too, actually.
Bagels and boba is what's left of what's left. I mean, I think what Ariel, what it's getting at is like the trajectories.
Like a good Netflix show about like a Jewish Asian couple in Silver Lake or something like that.
That coffee and bagel app, apparently only Asians use it.
Is that what it is? Okay.
It's a
I mean, there is a place, right? I mean, like every time I brought up this panel, people are like, there is this restaurant by Columbia. And I was like, okay.
It's called Bobo.
No. It's like Sussman. It's like Sussman and Wu, or Wu and Sussman.
Oh, yeah, Nussman and Wu.
Yeah. I think they closed though. Anyway, sorry.
But certainly, like one of the concerns that
Nussbaum and Wu.
Yeah, Nussbaum.
Nussbaum. Sorry.
I used to go there when I remember. But the sense, certainly it's something that we come up against a lot in the magazine, is have we simply run out of things to say because the particularity of identity is just bagels? And like that seems very pressing, but I mean, obviously I'm overstating this, but like and this is something you all talk about on the podcast. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about how you see the kind of longer trajectory of Asian American politicization right now. I mean, that by nature of that's a little bit of speculative, because like we obviously don't know like the next 2 years, let alone the next 5 years, are going to look like. But when you do say that you're kind of that it's not the desire for something beyond like the boba politics that you mentioned, like what are you thinking of in particular? Like what does that look like?
I don't know. It's the real question. Yeah, I don't know, because it's sometimes I feel bad because like boba liberal has basically become like a slur online, and I didn't come up with it, so that's not why I feel bad, but I feel bad because when people do ask about alternatives, you know, it's difficult because you know, you can say, well, you should engage in a type of working. This is what what I wrote about at some point. It's like, oh, we should engage in like a type of, if we are going to do any sort of identity, and it seems like it's almost impossible to ask a lot of Asian people to forget that they're Asian, right? Like, it's not going to happen. Is there a way that we can recenter our concerns around the concerns of working class Asian people who, you know, are struggling with all sorts of policy-based and very easily identifiable issues that we could all rally around, right? Is there a way that we can sort of abstract out our own narcissistic feelings about belonging in, like, you know, elite white culture or whatever, right? And I can say that stuff, but man, we're very far from that, you know, and it's hard, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge that is a far place from where we're at. Most people are very happy being boba liberals, right? And it's hard to argue against that, right? You're just like, well, I don't know, like, you know, I just want to live my life and I'll go root for the team in the World Cup that represents the country that I'm from. And I'm like, yeah.
But is there something,
Well,
is there a particular like utility there or something like why do this? I mean, I'm asking you the question we ask ourselves every day, like why speak from this position with one another about these issues at this time, you know?
I mean, I guess I have a thought about it, which is that, you know, Jay has a book coming out that looks at post-1965 Asian American formation. And obviously that immigration law has really changed the face of the country and is why we have this discrete thing called Asian America. But Asian America was, you know, being a kind of political invention of 1968, had a sort of, I guess, like a demand or a challenge in it, which is to say there isn't necessarily anything kind of like organic or natural about this thing called Asian America grouping these people together, right? But we're going to do that because it has a political content that is actually useful, that is actually a thing to look back on as a kind of, you know, whatever, even if it's a residue, even if it's some sort of memory that actually doesn't belong to us, that we can say like, oh, that was this aspiration to have a vision of third world solidarity, to have a vision of a robust welfare state that would include everybody, right? So, you know, I think like I'll speak for Andy and Jay. I don't know if they'll agree, but I think for Andy and Jay and I, like we get together every other day or whatever and do this every week because we're interested in that call. Like we're interested in what is the content of that? Can it be continued into a present? Even though like, yes, of course, this synthetic identity has blistered and, you know, broken up into all of these different pieces that are, you know, right-wing Hindus and are, you know, billionaire Singaporeans and like, you know, Chinese, you know, Trump lovers, like there's all these different groups. And yet, you know, at the basis of the creation moment, there is like a thing that we can kind of like think back to and try to like imagine that will propel us. So in addition to the kind of, you know, just sort of crude, but sometimes fun, like identity stuff that makes us want to be friends and hang out, you know, because we have things in common. I think there is this sort of political memory. And I think, you know, like I was talking to a friend who's in Asian American studies the other day, and she was talking about how basically for the last decade in Asian American studies, which, you know, we talk about a lot because it's basically coextensive with the creation of Asian American identity, right? That it's been struggling with this question of if there's so much demographic flux in what Asian Americanness is, like could there actually instead be a non-demographic Asian American studies that looks instead to a kind of political content or ideological content instead of a demographic content? So to me, that's also about this kind of question of like what you guys are trying to ask about, like what is or what was the Jew, you know, or what is anti-Semitism without the Jew? Like in a way, this is also like what is Asian American studies or Asian Americanness without the Asian American body or sort of identity. So I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about. Like, sure, it's synthetic and fake and, you know, kind of created, but maybe it's also useful.
Well, for me, it's like, you know, there comes a time when everybody who is along these paths just turns into a full-on class reductionist, right? You just kind of have a period. I don't know if I'm out of it yet, but, you know, certainly have gone through periods of it since I was 19 years old. And and I don't know, it's very hard to imagine that you could convince, like I said before, it's just very hard. Like if what your goal is that the people that you feel like you have the best shot at, converting into some sort of politics or rallying around a certain type of politics, if your goal is to try and reach them, it's very hard to do it if those people are not white, to talk to them and to tell them to forget all this stuff that they've been told about themselves. And a lot of times that stuff is very meaningful now. I disagree with Tammy. I don't think the late 60s moment really is too meaningful in terms of how we should construct this stuff, but that's one of the things that we disagree with about on the show. But I do think that, like, it's just very, I don't know. I think about like the Korean people that I know. I think that they would be very open. A lot of them did vote for like Bernie Sanders, for example, right? Like they got excited about it. Like my parents got very excited about Bernie Sanders and went to Bernie Sanders rallies. Like it's not like it's impossible to tell those people that about like what these politics could do for them. The part that's hard is to just be like, but you can't talk about it in the context of your own identity and nation of origin, because, and I guess I have just come to the point where I just feel like, even if I feel like maybe class reduction in some sort of clean, totally argumentative kind of like debate brain way is like correct, like there's just like, what are you going to do? Like you're just going to tell everyone, actually, I'm right, like who gives a shit about boba and like kimchi and, bibimbap, like, stop being so lame. Like it doesn't work. And so that's sort of where I've come out on it, right? Like I am a person who was born in Korea, and I feel like I can communicate with people who are born from Korea, and I don't want to lose the commonalities that we have out of some push for ideological ideological being right about this stuff. Anyway, Andy, I'm sorry I cut you off.
No, I was actually kind of thinking about how I would phrase this. I kind of think the class reductionist line you might be underrating it. I think I mean, I think the way I've come at this stuff is that, between these two identities, like Asian American, Asian, and leftist, right? To me, it was actually, I think I spend most of my time thinking about the class, the leftism, like the capitalism stuff, right? That to me was, I kind of eventually at some point in my like intellectual academic journey decided that actually matters most to most people. Like everyday life is mostly structured by these broad economic forces. And then in delving into like reading about that stuff and getting more interested in that stuff, then you come to this realization like, well, most of that conversation takes place in the context of one part of the world, and coming from a different part of the world, meaning Western Europe, United States, and coming from a different part of the world, there's just as much, if not even more, capitalism in Asia. And maybe then from that, I kind of returned to this interest in like, my family or the experiences of my friends and family. And I think I became really excited about, not like excited might be the wrong word, but like interested, like there is this actual story to be told about a leftist story about capitalism. I think being interested in capitalism almost makes you like leftist anyway. I think that is what like the heart of leftism is, right? Interested in like the inequality produced by capitalism. And there is a way that story, in particular in the context of Asia, and by extension perhaps Asian America, especially post-65, contemporary, the sort of Asia Pacific world, is something that I could feel invested in, but also not feel like the sort of internal struggle between cultural identity versus class versus reductionism, right? Like, and I don't know exactly how I would structure that, but I think it was by leaving the sort of identity first worldview, which is probably like my high school worldview maybe, and reading like about capitalism and economics and blah, blah, that allowed me to kind of come back and feel like there's a way to understand this all without feeling like there's this huge internal struggle. Like basically if the goal, if the target, if the subject matter is always ultimately global capitalism, right? Then, I don't think it has to be this like particular versus universal struggle all the time. Like in understanding a particular history, like the particular history of like Asian Americans, Asian diaspora, you are also simultaneously, hopefully, right, contributing to a discussion about what's going on globally as well.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
that's an academic answer, but that's I think there's a political implications there as well, right?
yeah, I mean, I think that also, like, generally what we're talking about is the usefulness of identity as an organizing framework. I mean, like, for us, it's like very clear. If we didn't exist as like a Jewish voice on the left, we would be ceding particularly the ground on Israel-Palestine and American politics, which really does affect American politics significantly in some ways, you know, to others who are going to use that space. And also, I mean, I know particularly for Josh and I, like that, I mean, I don't know about you, Josh, but I'm assuming because of what I know about you, like that was actually your entry point, and it was certainly my entry point into leftist politics is around Israel-Palestine in particular. Like, I was very much a liberal until I started to like do that work around Palestine. And that's very useful. Like, that's been a useful place, you know, but I do think that when we talk about it in terms of currents, we talk about it being like identity being a starting point and not an ending point, like a way to sort of open up onto the world and not
exactly
down. You know, like we think of, like, we say in terms of pitches, even when we ask for pitches, we say like Jewishness is the starting point and not the destination, basically. Sometimes it's neither, actually, and sometimes it's sort of like a faint echo. But that is sort of, I mean, it's hard to, I don't think like anyone can say that it's not useful, and also that it isn't, that it, I mean, you're immediately talking about your family, you're immediately talking about your history. It's kind of hard for like an individual in the world to be like, I'm not interested in that, or like, that doesn't, there's nothing there for me, you know? So it's a kind of a powerful tool that it would be very hard to leave on the table, I think.
yeah I feel that way. I mean, this is the only Asian American like project I'm involved with, but mostly it's probably true for Andy and Jay too. But yeah, I mean, I think most of my politicization has been around like economic and labor issues, labor organizing. But you know, to some extent, I think like evaluating and understanding the experience of like working class undocumented like Asian immigrants was like part of that journey. So, and I think like even to those people, even though they're new immigrants, like there was something somewhat coherent about a kind of like Asian Americanness or Asianness in the US that, you know, was a useful organizing principle, just strategically, just in terms of even like the kind of, you know, nuts and bolts of bringing people to a protest, or, you know, who are you canvassing, who are you attracting to a campaign. So I think in that sense, I think even though like the class concerns are first, the economic goals are first, there was a kind of gateway.
Yeah.
And I think that one thing that struck me, Ariel, when I was hearing what you were saying, was that, like, I think that one of the differences is that there is no gateway like Israel-Palestine, I think, for a lot of people who would identify as Asian American to get into left or left-leaning politics, right? There's no sort of thing that has a long tradition and that will be discussed and that you almost have to force yourself to take a position on if you're of that group. And right now, a lot of those things are being created for Asian Americans in ways that are, and I think that, like, if our podcast is anything, it's basically just us being like, yeah, no, like, we're, pass, right? Like, on all the things that are invented. Like, for example, one of the things that is being put out there, obviously, like, what's your stance on, like, how do we defend ourselves, right? Is one that has come up. Before that, it was like, well, what is your stance on SHSAT and Stuyvesant and affirmative action? And so these, I think, are becoming the entry points for Asian Americans to go into politics. And what's been concerning to me is that the response from the left is to sort of build a history of collective trauma as the response, right? And to use that as the entry point. And so it's like saying, well, it's like these tweet threads you see, or these television series that you watch about the Chinese Exclusion Act, or Vincent Chin, Moments of Violence. And, I don't know if that really is a particularly good counter, right? Because we don't all experience all those types of violence, right? Like I have particular family things, like, I don't know, half of my extended family because they're in North Korea. If no, like that's a very specific type of thing, but that doesn't really mean much to Andy, right? Because
care.
Andy, well, thank you. And so it's hard because the group is so fractured to build that type of history, to have access into that history. And it seems like the reason why people are using that as the entry point is because that is how other groups build actual entry points, right? So, for example, you can see obvious, I don't know, Michael Eric Dyson wrote this thing about how like we should see Asian American history in the same way that we see Black American history. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Like I don't think that you can say that, because one is like a tradition, people who've been here for 400 or 500 years, right? And have direct descendants who lived through these things. And then the rest of it is just like people who came post 1965, who, if you ask their parents, do you know what the Chinese Exclusion Act is? I bet most don't know, or have heard about it, but don't really think about it too much. And so, yeah, it's interesting to compare like the rights entry point and the left entry point in this way. And so I don't know, on the podcast, like we do, I think a lot of what we talk about are like, well, what is like the correct entry point, or what is a way to have an entry point into this that would feel like significant and would allow people to actually like organize people and go forward. I don't know. Do we have an answer yet outside of donating to the Patreon and participating in our
I think
Discord?
we have a few. I mean, I feel like we're
Discord
interested
community.
in immigrant rights. We're interested in labor. We're interested in welfare statism. We're interested in anti-imperial politics. So I think we're offering those. We're trying to offer those as that entry point, as a
Right.
thing that actually could be constitutive of this.
Right.
But it is true that like there really isn't anything like trauma as like a
Right.
motivator. I mean, it is true that like
Yeah.
part of actually what that responsa was, that piece was was like some of the Jewish groups on the left basically saying like, well, we recognize that Jews have a deep need to like they're afraid of anti-Semitism, especially in the post Tree of Life moment and Trump and everything. So like, how do we redirect that? Even if we don't necessarily like buy into it completely, how do we redirect that? Actually, like channel it into these, into like what we would consider better areas. And I think what we were saying was sort of like, actually, like, this is really scary. Like we're playing a bit with fire here, because you could get stuck. I mean, it's very easy. I'll just speak for Jews. I'll speak for all Jews. It's like very easy to just get stuck there. I mean, get stuck in a place where like you don't go any further. Actually,
definitely.
And in fact, what we were sort of noticing is that there were a lot of liberal Jews who were in fact getting stuck there.
I have almost like a historical question. I know Josh and I were talking about this earlier, how there's this kind of stereotype that in New York City, the Jewish groups would be kind of polarized into, maybe like the financial classes, and the others they would just all be socialists, and like in Washington Square Park, basically, right? And is there like a theory for
when was this? Like, you mean this year?
No, like 100 years ago,
historically,
or after World War II, right? But is there a theory for why? Because I mean, there is no analog for East Asians. There are no East Asian socialists in Washington Square Park. But I guess the question is there something sort of?
Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Say what?
I think it was Union Square for what it's.
Oh, Union Square. Yeah, sorry. No.
All the were around Union Square.
Yeah. And anyway, is there like a reason for why, like, is it the experience of anti-Semitism? Is it being like class traders or something? Is there like a sort of Jewish specific explanation?
They were poor immigrants.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like at that time, there was like a real split between sort of like older German immigrants who were more wealthy, who like wanted to consolidate power and also like recode the community in a more conservative, more white assimilated manner.
Right.
And then there were, essentially the Jewish masses who had brought, I think like there's like now historians are saying different things about like, where did the socialism come from? That like, I think traditionally we think of it as like coming over from Europe, from some of these like,
Yeah.
but I think now they're saying that also it like kind of went back and forth a bit. But yeah, I mean, they were immigrants. That's,
Yeah.
But we also know that not all poor working class people become socialists, right? Like
Yeah.
they can also go in different directions also. So I don't know if there's an explanation, I guess, within Jewish studies or just among Jewish community for like where did this tradition come from? Is there a Jewish specific explanation for this tradition?
There's certainly an exceptionalist answer.
There's a not good answer, which is, I mean, so like you'll hear that in like people who care a lot about Jewish Marxism, there is often a tendency to read into the Jewish radical tradition, which is a real thing at this point, that like it's a kind of secularization of messianism. And I actually do not think that's true, for what it's worth. I mean, there are certainly people who can make that, but I think it's more complicated than that. I don't think now we're gonna have to go brief this, but it's also I think I'm always inclined to return it to try to be a little bit more historically specific. And you just had a very large segment of Jewish immigration in the early 20th century prior to the 1924 Immigration Act who were coming from the former Tsarist Empire.
Yeah,
you didn't have so many political options in what was Tsarist Russia, and it was just a very it was a place where a lot of different kinds of radicalism were happening, and Jews were among the communities, partially or in large part because of the lack of proper citizenship under the Tsarist rule that made Jews inclined towards political radicalism. I mean, that's like that to me. I think that's like the better explanation. Although obviously, like there are all these stories of people who like had religious upbringings and then became like socialists because that was what they thought like bringing the revolution was like more real and more important. Like was like bringing the Messiah. I mean, I just totally lost my train of thought, but there was a connection here that I was going to make about immigrant trajectories.
I just don't know if there's any other. Sorry, I just don't know if there's any other groups that have that kind of socialist tradition in the U.S. That are analogous. I don't know. I mean, Tammy, sorry.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like there were huge swaths of, for instance, like Irish socialists, and but I was also going to mention that before the 65 Act, there were also like very concentrated communities of like Chinese leftists who were really excited about like the Chinese Revolution, who were here. I mean, obviously it wasn't a huge population, but they were active in Chinatown. There were a bunch of leftist socialist newspapers. Obviously there
were IWK and stuff.
No, but yeah, that too.
Before,
but
before like sort of the Maoist groups in the 60s, or
yeah, like in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah. And and so I mean, obviously things didn't go great with Mao after that, but there was this kind of moment with
that's the sign off to our show at the end. We say thank you for listening to the show. Obviously things didn't go great for Mao.
Oh, I mean, some of the tankies are definitely kind of resurrecting Maoist stuff, which anyway, but yeah.
It's important to like really mention that like the majority of Jews that, I mean, like we are not, Josh and I in particular are not like descended from that lineage I mean, like, yes and no, but like you are actually a little more than I'm definitely not. My family is more recent immigrants to the United States, but like that tradition was totally stamped out, like, and buried. So like that's a broken lineage. Like that's a lineage that a lot of, like with the resurgence of the left, has become sort of, exciting to reclaim, but it is in fact a reclamation. And there's also a lot of like, like weird cosplaying around it. And like,
yeah,
it's not, it's because, most of our parents, were not that, or like if they were, they didn't talk about it in those terms because
Mhm.
McCarthyism and ways that they really were afraid to discuss it. So it's just worth noting that like it's not like that sort of like carried through, and we
Yeah.
just picked it back up
Right,
and
yeah.
It's not like a living Vivian Gornick book. It's yeah.
much as Jewish
I mean,
current.
those people do exist, and like the people who did manage to hold on their commitments are actually the people just who
They're
kept the
Jewish
flame
currents.
Jewish currents alive.
Yeah.
But
That's awesome.
to the extent that I have a relationship to this, my grandmother came out of the Jewish socialist milieu in the Bronx, but basically renounced it. And my
Yeah.
father grew up without any living memory of this as a political tradition, even though he was actually sent to a sleepaway camp that was founded by the rival ideological orientation to Jewish currents. They were the
Wow.
they were the that's an I have a sort of anti-Stalinist Jewish socialist heritage, and I'm now working at the ex-Stalinist publication. But my bubby is not alive to just totally shocked by like what this could be. But I think that like that if we're to the extent that generation can understand this project or can see this project, it's really comprehensible. I mean, I asked Vivian Gornick actually about Jewish currents, and she was like, and it's interesting what she said to me. She said, I cannot see why Jewishness would be a useful political identity in the United States.
Yeah.
It was
Oh,
not
wow.
made no sense to her.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. I just want to stop us also because like, looking at time and stuff, there are like comments in the Q&A probably that are
and questions.
I don't know if we want to like take a look at the Q&A. It's a little chaotic because I guess we're all just going to read them now or something.
Amongst ourselves.
It might be worth just like peeking at what's going on in there.
Well, we haven't talked too much about the kind of education piece, but Rachel Cohen, friend of the show and friend of the magazine, has a question that perhaps could be useful, and it relates to our discussion of kind of organizing on the right. So yeah, I don't know if you guys want to take that up.
Says, I guess I'm just thinking out loud about how certainly Jews on the left, have stayed out of the affirmative action, testing, schools, mission stuff. Or maybe Asian American is what AA stands for. I think many just don't want to touch it. But I am struck by what Jay said about how in a lot of ways it tends to be a kind of politicizing entry point for a lot of Asian people, either as students or their parents. And I wonder how, if at all, Jews can and should engage with that. Jews do have histories around this. Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the way in which this conversation has had the most right now is the similarities between educational testing, these types of issues, and how similar it was for Jews in the 1920s and for Asian Americans now. And it's become a real right-wing talking point. I don't know, it's almost like an induction ceremony if you want to get into the Federalist Society and you want to be like a legal scholar and clerk for Clarence Thomas, you have to know all of this sort of stuff, right? And yeah, it's a difficult thing because like I can't speak to what the Jewish response should be, but I do know how right-wing like Jewish commentators have really gravitated towards this, right? So like I was saying before that we started the show, like Bethany Mandel seems to tweet about this a lot. And if, we can sort of cringe or whatever and, sort of, but at some point, if you read the actual language in the 1920s and what Harvard was doing at that point, and then you read what they're doing now, word for word the same. And it's impossible to deny that. And you can make all sorts of caveated, squishy arguments about why that's, why we should have different types of, why it's not the same. I think that's a little bit less convincing, right? Like it seems like it's the same, right? Like the difference in the 1920s, they're a little more blatant about it, right? Like they gave you like a J score based on how Jewish you seemed on your there's no A score at this point, right? So but I don't know, it's a real problem, I think, because I think that it's the same thing. I guess I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's a very difficult issue because people are going to seek that stuff out, and they're going to point out all the similarities, and it's very hard to make an argument against things that match up word for word 90 years apart, where one is determined by consensus to be, part of an anti-Semitic exclusion type of politics, and why is this one not, right? Like, what is the difference? And it's very hard to give an answer to that, because I think that at some level there probably is not much difference, right? And then you have to start your politics after the point where you admit that, yes, this is similar. It's very hard, and most people give up at that point. They say, well, and then they sort of go back and they kind of repeat liberal talking points about diversity, or and I think that might be the right response. I think that that's probably right, but they've really painted us in a corner here.
Well, I mean, I guess it, like, without having an answer at all, I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning. It's just like, we know that they are partnering on this, and so, like, in the same way that liberals are partnering on hate crime stuff, like, the right is really partnering on the education stuff. And like, it's happening in ethnic studies, like the kind of why are we being left out kind of thing. I mean, the AJC, the American Jewish Congress, really like recruited from like Korean American organizations and stuff to be like, why aren't our stories being told in the same way?
Wow, really? Wow.
Yeah,
so was that recently?
And this is, like, we've been covering this a lot. It's like, it really, like, for the Jewish organizations, is about Zionism, like, don't talk about Palestinians. Right. But they've recruited like all these different kinds of people, and including Asian groups, even though, Asian American studies is like core to the ethnic studies curriculum. There is like questions about inclusion, like if there's enough about a specific group or whatever, and how they're being portrayed, et cetera, et cetera. So they've like recruited a lot of people with like diverse grievances about ethnic studies, So the point, I think it's just like sort of worth knowing that, like, even if we don't have the answer yet, it seems really important that actually we start talking about what our answer is going to be. It's a little easier for them because they have an easier tool to use, which is just grievance.
Right. And why does this one not look like this one? It's like the easiest political argument to make, right? This, like, I mean, you see it everywhere. Like, it's and essentially, like, what Twitter is amazing at is essentially pointing out that one thing does not look like the other thing.
Well, and like a real resistance to like power analysis and relationships.
Right. It's just like
and stuff. So I think it's like more important, I think, than even talking about like, what are we going to do about this? Because I don't think, I mean, personally, I have no answer. It just seems important to be like, well, we have to come up with a response together. Like,
right. Yeah. Because it is true that a lot of the people who defend Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and the SHSAT, it's a lot of Jewish community groups as well, with Chinese community groups, and that those two seem to be the two biggest. And the argument from the Jewish groups is that Stuyvesant used to be mostly Jewish before it was mostly Asian, right? And how can we stand by and allow, if we benefited from this, how can we pull up the ladder behind us in the name of some vague equity issue? And that's also a powerful argument. I don't know. It's like I apologize for just being like, yeah, the right seems to have a better argument for everything. What are we doing?
I mean, I think what you're saying though gets to an important thing, and I want to touch on it because it's one of the other questions that Matthew Hom asked about the increased visibility and outspokenness of Asian American Jews from diverse backgrounds who are embedded in the Jewish left, and asking what are the limitations of framing these conversations around making comparisons between the Jewish and Asian experiences in which the normativity of Jewish whiteness is presumed. And I think that's a great question, and I think that like certainly we don't want to like reify the normativity of Jewish whiteness, because we recognize that they're actually Jews are diverse, and there are lots of Jews of color, and in some ways, listening to their experience is an important part of the coalition building work that we need to do. I think that that's certainly a principle of Jewish currents and how we're trying to think about this. But I actually think that in relationship to the affirmative action question, the Jewish the whitening of the Jews is an important like feature of that. And so, you know, it's because I think that many Jews are white in America that a feeling that it would be, I think that plays into how the Jewish community is addressed. I think the Jewish community relates to the question of affirmative action not as Jews but as white people today, and that's why it's really just, or because especially because most American Jews are actually liberal and probably support affirmative action as good white liberals, but not particularly as Jews necessarily, although I'm sure that there are many American Jews who describe a commitment to affirmative action as part of their kind of social justice liberalism that's inflected by their Jewish values. But like that's the you know, I know in ethnic studies is a little bit of or American studies are kind of thinking about like from racialization to ethnicization, and then once after that, then you know Jews are white people of another variant, and that determines what, and many Jews are white, and that determines what their politics are on this.
I wanted to also take up that question I mean, I know that you guys have talked on the podcast about the limitations that we have in vocabulary in terms of talking about mixedness, you know? And I think that relates a bit to Matthew's comment about basically like what are the potentialities for thinking about like ways that mixedness, in this case like Jewish and Asian, you know, like does that open something up? Like is that like, you know, it's hard on this panel obviously, and I'm sure.
Oh yeah, well I think this is my general thought, or this is like my, you know, I think about this all the time. My daughter is half Jewish, you know, and we did the social justice Haggadah, you know, and that did a Seder, and you know, it's very moving to me, you know, hearing her read it and do the questions and everything, because even though I have no real familiarity with a lot of this stuff, and I don't know, I think about it in two contexts. I guess the first thing, and this is something that my friend pointed out to me, who is also Korean, who has a kid who is half Jewish as well. She was just, we were at dinner at some point, and she was just like the people who like half Jewish, half Korean kids are going to be the most privileged people in America if you look at their parents' educational status and income level. And I thought about it, and I was like, it's probably true. Like if you want to subdivide that much, right? And like what does that mean? And like what is that identity going to be? Something I don't know, I think about all the time, but I never think about it productively because I don't have any actual conclusions about it outside of that. But you know, where I lived in Brooklyn and where I live now in the Bay Area, you go anywhere and you know, it's not like when I was growing up, right? Like there's a ton of like half Asian, half Jewish kids, and you know, they almost gravitate to one another even at young ages. I don't know what to really do about it except to point out that, you know, it does seem like there is a demographic, there is this population now of young people, and some of them are, you know, a lot of them are adults now, right? But it's been about like 30-40 years, I think, and I have not read anything about this that I've found particularly great. So if there's stuff out there, then please, you know, let me know. But I think about it all the I you know, this is like half of my life is thinking about this sort of stuff. I wrote a whole chapter of my book about it, which was like basically me like, I don't know, you know, like what's going on here. So yeah,
there is some stuff out there, but I would say like mostly, as with like a lot of Jews of color in the Jewish community, there's been kind of like a position of agitation around white Jewish racism, you know, just because there's so much exclusion and kind of like assumption of like unbelonging that comes with that. And so I feel like that's kind of been a way that you see it coming up a lot in Jewish media, like that seems to be like the entry point. But it does seem like there are also people who are like pushing beyond that to think about some of the things that we're talking about here, like capital and immigration and these kinds of things.
I have a reaction. I don't know if this is purely anecdotal, but I was talking to someone recently who is half Asian, half Jewish, and they were saying that and this also applies like just half Asians in general, right? That all of them are kind of trained to write this college essay about how they bring the best of both worlds out, and they can bring out the best of their Asian side and the best of their white side or Jewish side or whatever, or whatever other group, right? And they feel almost pressure to make this like almost eugenicist argument, right? Like they're like doubly as good.
That seems like the opposite of what would be effective, though. I mean, if I would feel like if somebody read that, if you know, in one of these schools where the entire, I don't know, like whatever Ivy League school they read this, they'd be like, this person is like a racist, you know, like it seems like isn't that like a very obviously racist thing to say?
I think that's an
imagine
accepted kind
like
of
like an effective college essay.
I think, but I think that is like an effective, like, or an accepted kind of
Steve Saylor
eugenicist.
and Charles Murray on this, you know, like in fact, like I don't know, really, like that's an accepted essay, like that seems.
I mean, according to this, you know, this person I was talking to is like, this is this kind of universal experience where people kind of project onto you, right? These sort of beliefs about, you know, your combination of races, I guess. So I almost wonder, it's probably just analogous to like if any person where you kind of project some sort of like political meaning onto their identity, like do they necessarily want to inhabit it? It's kind of up to them. I almost feel like you know, I mean, if there are half Jewish, half Asian, or you know, Asian American Jewish people who want to like take up that call, I guess, you know, great for them if they want to. But I almost wonder like, maybe they feel if we would like put too much onto mixed people to kind of like represent all these sides and kind of represent this rainbow coalition like in one person, you know.
I wonder if we could end, since we're like getting to the end, if we could end with a question that came up from Anna. Just about sort of, I mean, I think we would have to go through a pretty lightning round, but about what is it that might prevent leftist solidarity building and coalition building between Jewish and Asian American communities and Asian American Jewish communities? And so like, what are the barriers that make that work challenging? Do you guys have thoughts on that before we close?
I mean, there's just the traditional reasons for why they're not leftists, but I think if they are together, bounded together in leftist positions, leftism, or you know, like a leftist position should be, you know, capacious and global, and you know, also involved in all sorts of parts of the world. It would just be more like if they aren't very, you know, maybe they're just conservative and or nationalists about their particular group. But
let's say just like on the left, like if we're just talking about why leftists might be having trouble, or like what are the barriers to leftists coming together and working on this kind of stuff?
I think that maybe it's because, you know, the natural position for Asian American leftists to be concerned about is the Asian American like working class. And so maybe that is like a specific concern that would be, you know, kind of that identity would actually be like the stumbling point at that point, right? Because we're just like, yeah, that's, you know, but I don't know. I just think that the commonalities are just so kind of obvious, and you can say them in joking ways, but it doesn't mean that they're wrong, you know? But I think there's a lot of, I don't know, I just think there's a lot of potential there. But I don't know what the stumbling points would be outside of just like, well, you know, why are you just talking about your stuff too much, which is obviously one of the things that you try and not do, you know, in these types of coalitions.
I think one perhaps natural place that more organizing could be done is around immigrant rights. And you saw maybe there were sort of glimmers of this around the kind of initial like children in cages moment. I mean, obviously that hasn't passed and much more work needs to be done, but where you saw, progressive and leftist Jews who were coming out and saying like, we know this history. And like, of course, like the sort of high profile coverage of like, Japanese American survivors of the concentration camps here who were coming out for children in cages and stuff. So I do think that like potential exists, but I would say like one thing that hasn't been practiced maybe enough like in that space has been that Asian Americans will kind of naturally band together with like African immigrants and Latino immigrants, but won't like necessarily consider Jews as like an ethnic group that would like be interested in that, because perhaps there's an assumed distance from migration, which obviously has to do with like the whitening of Jews, the history of Jews. But yeah, so I think like, but maybe there's something there. And I think that also ties into like an anti-imperial politics, which we touched on a bit earlier, as a space where like that is natural for leftist Jews and Asians to come together.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like what I'm thinking listening to you, Tammy, is like, I think probably one of the barriers is shame, because a lot of the things that white Jews and Asian Americans would like think about together are things that have to do with privilege, and or like the ways that like privilege is perceived, or in the ways that we were talking about with the Aiko Day book. And so I think like just on that level, it's not as much fun to think through those things, or like, you'd have to really want to put your egg, like, especially for, I think maybe, I don't know, but maybe for Asian Americans, like to throw in your lot with the Jews. I mean, like there's like a particular valence around that. I mean, like, I don't know, like, I think that could be one reason why. It's just like, it's, a kind of that there's like something difficult or embarrassing that has to do with like whiteness and white adjacency and class uplift that is like maybe preventing some of these conversations from happening in the way that would be useful.
I will say my own, this is totally anecdotal and specific, but when I was growing up in North Carolina, I'm a little older. I think I'm probably the oldest person in this group right now, but most of my friends are Jewish, and it was because they weren't really white at the time, and so it was like I felt like maybe I thought about it recently. It's like, well, maybe it's the most analogous thing, but I guess it's just very different, right, in different parts of the country. Like I don't think that the Jewish kids who went to high school with me, elementary school with me, would have considered themselves white. I didn't consider myself white, and our friendship was very natural in that sort of way. But I guess it's very, as I've gone out, I'm no longer 14 years old, and so I found that it is different. But I don't know. I guess it was, for me growing up, it was like much more obvious, I think. But I guess it's different in different places.
Well, we're at 8:30.
Yeah, should we close it out?
Yeah, I think we should close it out.
Yeah, with apologies to all the people who asked great questions in the chat.
Yeah, there is just so much. I think like we could have this conversation for a longer, and there's obviously kind of catharsis about being like, oh my God, thank God there's other people who could talk to, because like if we only talk to, I feel this, like if there's no other, if there aren't different kinds of people to bounce ideas off of and talk through different kinds of experiences, I'm gonna lose my mind. But also yeah, there is a lot. This has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed
thank
this.
you.
Thank you guys so much.
A lot, and I don't know, hopefully it's the beginning of these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe you should tell people how to find you, and we'll tell people how to find us, I guess. We have to do those things.
Oh yeah, well you can find our podcast. It's called Time to Say Goodbye. It's on Substack. It's just goodbye.substack.com, and you can find all the information is there. You can figure it out.
Great. We're jewishcurrents.org. Subscribe. This is our most recent issue. You'll And yeah, that's it. This will be recorded. So if you liked it, you can share it. It'll be on our YouTube page. And that is that. Thanks everyone.
Okay.